Alright, seems to be going. G'day class, my name is Mr. Walsh. I'll be your teacher for the day and we'll be cracking on with our very deep investigation into the Aztec and the New World. Carrying on from last week, we've covered a few of the main players. We've got Christopher Columbus, Spanish explorer, arrives in today what we know as the Caribbean in 1492 and discovers the New World. We have Hernan Cortez, the first conquistador to travel into the Mexican mainland about 30 years later, and he invades Tenochtitlan, as we know, and takes over the empire, taking the Aztec king Montezuma hostage, and eventually wiping out the Aztec civilization altogether. So we've got the broad strokes of this period of history, but today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into our understandings of the people at the time. And to do this, we are going to use an idea which I think is great, and which has been used by many, many historians, is used by all historians in fact, and is the concept of historical empathy. And does anybody know what historical empathy, or even just empathy, might mean? Yeah, so empathy, the ability to put yourself into the shoes of someone else, to see things through their world, through their eyes. It's very important for historians to use this because obviously we see the world in the 21st century through very different eyes to those of the people in the past. So we use this idea, historical empathy, we look through the sources and we use the sources to help broaden our understanding of the perspectives of people. And we also use these understandings to critique the sources, to try and figure out, where the sources might be misleading us, what somebody's motivation for writing something a particular way would be. So we'll crack on. First historical empathy test is easy. That's Columbus. I think these two maps illustrate really well what Columbus's mindset was in 1492 when he set out. Does anybody see any differences between these two maps? On the left here is the Columbus map. That's the Martellus map, which was the map of the world in the 1400s as people understood it. And here we have a classic 21st century map that would be available to any of you today and our current understanding of the globe. So any ideas, any instant observations we can make about the two different maps? Yeah. So obvious one. We have the New World here in North and South America, which are completely absent from this conception here. We have Asia, Africa, and Europe. You can see with Africa, they hadn't actually been around the bottom half of Africa yet, so they just kind of kept extending it along and kind of outside the boundaries of the map, just taking a bit of artistic license. They didn't really know what to do there. I think it was in 1520, 1521 maybe, another Spanish explorer went around there and came to the Spice Isles over here, which is what Christopher Columbus was looking for when he sailed off to the west. And he was imagining that he'd get a straight shot through the west and he'd come back out the other side into the Spice Isles. Of course, we know today that he didn't get that opportunity. Instead, he went straight out to the west and ran into America. And I think these two maps really illustrate this whole idea of the New World, and Columbus, when he found the New World, how much that changed his perspective of the way the globe was made up. Because as you can see, Asia, Africa, and Europe are actually all one landmass. It's all connected, whereas the New World was a discrete, complete landmass all unto itself that had its own people, its own trees and flora and fauna, animals and trees. Everything was different there, and nothing was recognizable It was literally a new world. It's a very appropriate way to describe it. So we'll just crack on. Next slide. So I think what would be helpful for us to do when we're trying to come up with this idea of historical empathy is to try and do a few thought experiments. So this is a good one, I think. If we can just imagine that we've gone to Mars, that we're not in a classroom, we're in a spaceship, and that spaceship has hurtled through the atmosphere and landed on Mars, and we have had the good fortune of landing bang in the middle of a Martian village, and we are surrounded by aliens, and we are the first humans to have ever made contact with these aliens. It's up to us to try and figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to interact, how our civilizations are going to come into contact with each other. And I'd just like to, think, what would you guys do? Like, if you were the first humans on Mars, how would you go about setting up a relationship with these Martians? Yep, so I could imagine that you might set up maybe some trade. The pen function does not seem to be working. That's okay. Maybe we'll just use the cursor, which is great. So we might set up some trade. We might visit their leader. We might, what else might we do? We might study them and see in what ways they could benefit us and we could benefit them. Then we might come to some mutual understandings about the universe. And I think it's probably pretty easy to say that nobody thought that we should enslave their people. And nobody thought that we should take their king hostage. And probably nobody thought that we should boil down all of their precious things into their raw materials just to ship them back home for our king. So nobody said pillage. I didn't hear pillage from the room. So I think this demonstrates how inappropriate it is to look at these times through the eyes of the 21st century, because their behavior of the Spanish people and also the Aztecs is just indescribable from our perspective. When Cortez entered Tenochtitlan, he behaved awfully, but he was also behaving in a way that Montezuma himself kind of accepted and thought was consistent with the ways that he behaved as well. The Aztecs pillaged neighboring tribes. They also tried to convert neighboring tribes into their own religion. They displayed a lot of the behaviors that the Spanish displayed. They just didn't have the battleships to take them overseas and to cast their empire further abroad. So I think we need to dig a little bit deeper. We need to try and figure out what made these people tick, what made the Aztecs, Montezuma tick, what made Hernan Cortez and the conquistadors tick. So I've got a few slides here about Aztec gods, and the Aztec gods and Aztec mythology in particular was very strong and dominated the Aztec way of life. They had a general conception of time which was different to that in the West, which was that time was circular. They lived in a kingdom that was surrounded by the ruins of other kingdoms, so they knew that their kingdom was one day going to collapse. They believed that time went in circles in this way. They thought that as they were successful at the moment, there would inevitably come a time when they would be unsuccessful. And this is borne out in their mythology of their creation myth as well, that the gods gave their own blood and they sacrificed themselves in order to bring the earth back. The earth has been destroyed 5 times within Aztec belief, or 4 times. They're in the 5th epoch in Aztec belief. This image here is actually a representation of a stone tablet that was found in the ruins of Mexico. And you can see the 4 first epochs and the 5th time, the current time, as represented by the Aztec man in the middle. So the Aztecs believed that this guy here, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, was also the god of the sun, and literally the sun. And every night he would do battle with his sister, the other god, Coyolxauhqui, who is the moon goddess. And every night they would do battle, and if Huitzilopochtli ever lost, then the sun wouldn't come up the following day and the Aztec people would be ruined. The Aztec people believed that in order to avoid this ruination, they needed to give blood to Huitzilopochtli every day. So the way they gave blood was they did different ways of giving blood. One very civilized way was every now and then, every few times a day, they'd get a little bone or pin and put it through their finger or through their lip, and they would just drop a few pieces of blood out as a little gesture to the gods. But they also had kind of more ceremonial ways of doing it as well, which was generally around human sacrifice. So up to 25,000 people are expected to have been sacrificed every year in Tenochtitlan. From this here, this is the great temple of Huitzilopochtli, which sat in the middle of Tenochtitlan, with one side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, and the other side to Tlaloc, the rain god. And they would capture warriors from warring tribes, like the Tlaxcaltec that Cortez allied with, and they would hold them up. They'd get 4 people on either side of the person and splay them across and cut open their heart, pull their heart out, and every now and then a priest might eat the heart, or they would incinerate the heart and leave it as an offering for the gods. But this was all to ensure that the Aztec people continued to survive and that the current age, the 5th age, the age of the sun, could keep continuing. And that's the Aztec system of belief, and this is the Spanish system of belief, which was also incredibly religious, and in very different ways to the Aztecs, but kind of with a lot of similarities as well. So the Spanish set up the encomienda system, which was a system of servitude or slavery in the Americas, whereby a Spanish conqueror would get a plot of land, and all the villages associated with that plot of land would have to give them agricultural goods, wealth, basically, in return for their Christianizing. So they would be in control of baptizing and making the native people Roman Catholics, which was a bizarre idea for people who had only just discovered of a place called Rome. Up here on your left, you can see a very sympathetic picture of this. This would be a Spanish imagery of the native people being baptized by Franciscan monks, and up here on your right is maybe a more realistic impression of what this looked like, which was something very close to slavery. Of course, people couldn't be bought and sold, but they were still under similar conditions. Another motivating force for the Spanish was their hunt for gold. Upon arriving in Tenochtitlan, Cortez and his conquistadors gathered up as much gold as they could. They melted them down into gold bars called gold ingots, and they sent them back to Spain. Some as their own earnings, but they were also owed the king 1/5 of all of their earnings. It was very important that Hernan Cortez gave this gold to the king, because at the time he was kind of not really well liked and kind of had to prove himself to the king that what he was doing was Christian, really, and good, in good faith to the Spanish Empire. So one more slide. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but we're going to get to some more fun stuff soon. This is a slide about sources. So we know all of this, but we need to know how we know all of this. It's very important in history that we always push back onto the sources, because sometimes the sources will demonstrate to us the limits of our knowledge as well as what we do know. So for the Spanish perspective on the invasion of Tenochtitlan, we've got Cortez himself. and other conquistadors who wrote about the invasion. Cortez wrote letters to the Spanish king talking about how great his triumphs were, how beautiful the Aztec kingdom was, how much gold there was in the Aztec kingdom. There's a lot of great primary evidence here of the era, but there's also everything has to be taken with a touch of salt because there's great potential for bias. Cortez was basically writing a cover letter, he was writing a resume for the Spanish king saying, hey, I've just taken over this place in your name. Please employ me, basically. The Aztec perspective is very different and is very hard to get at as well because the Spanish destroyed a lot of the Aztec artifacts, but also because the Aztec people had hieroglyphic styles of writing similar to the ancient Egyptians, but they were not used to kind of write down narrative stories like English or Spanish at the time. So the Aztec perspective was written maybe 30, 40 years after the invasion by Franciscan monks who were kind of working as anthropologists at the time, trying to figure out all of the cultures, all of the beliefs that existed before the Spanish came to the New World, because they could see that the beliefs and cultures were being wiped out very quickly by plague and by conquest. So this guy here, Bernardino de Sahagún, he wrote the Florentine Codex, which is a giant book which was translated into English about 40 years ago and is free on the internet if you want to have a look at it. And in that we have got these wonderful illustrations done by Aztec people about their own beliefs and their own ways of life, and also some Aztec perspectives of what it was like to be under Spanish rule. Okay, so that was a lot. That was a lot of information that we just kind of barreled through there. So we're going to try and do a little recap here with the class. Just trying to figure out, with this idea of historical empathy in mind, what we could say were Cortez's motivations and beliefs, and what were Montezuma's motivations and beliefs. And I'm going to try my hardest to draw in the answers, whilst I apologise for the horror of my handwriting using this mouth. So yeah, Cortez's motivations, gold, of course. Other motivations are glory. Yeah. He is trying to spread Christianity. And he's trying to enlarge the kingdom of God for the Spanish people. He is also trying to prove himself to the Spanish king. So there's some kind of his own conquest there as well. Montezuma's motivations were to protect his people, protect himself, protect his gods, and he's probably also pretty humiliated because he's been taken hostage in his own kingdom by people he's never known or seen in his life. He has no idea what's going on really. But he's also got this circular notion of time in his ideas as well. So a lot of the documents actually show that Cortez wasn't particularly, he was sad, but he wasn't angry about what was happening, in the sense that he could see the writing on the wall. He knew that his civilization was coming to an end. So you have to keep in mind not just their motivations, but their understandings of the world. So circular time is what I've crudely written down there. Okay, so we're going to get to our first exercise here. We are going to use this idea of historical empathy to rewrite a scene as told by the opposing side. And so on your worksheets, we have a little scene written out by one of Cortez's conquistador contemporaries. And he describes the process by which they got all their gold. And I've got to say, it's an account that has definitely got two sides to it. And we're going to use this idea of historical empathy to try and figure out where the gaps are in the story, try and figure out where his motivations are, and also try and figure out how this would have been perceived by the Aztec people. I'll get you to write a little piece after we've gone through this in groups from the perspective of the Aztec people. And then the next slide, which I'm not going to show you yet, we've got the Aztec people's actual beliefs about this process, and we'll see how it all squares up. Okay, thanks.